Hello, my name is Shai, and I'm here to talk to you about jazz funerals. Now, I know you might be saying, what's a jazz funeral? I've never heard of that. A jazz funeral is a parade-style funeral that was created in New Orleans, Louisiana. It is a celebration of a passing of a loved one in a parade-style way. The jazz funeral has an extensive history, and there's many things that came together to create the jazz funeral that we know today. Now, the history is murky at best because there's so many accounts and so many retellings and so many things that go into the history of the jazz funeral that it's really hard to narrow down what's true and what's not and where it all came from. The history that we know today, though, the funerals that we know today, were influenced by a lot of specific cultures, and I would like to talk about those. So in the 1800s, you had the colonization of New Orleans, which brought you cultures from British cultures, Spanish cultures, and French cultures, and mixed those together. You also had the biggest slave trade port in New Orleans, which gave you the West African slave influences. You also later on had Mardi Gras Indians, which were people who wore costumes and did these extensive performances and were really lively and beautiful and over the top that were based on Native Americans. All of those you also had in the rise of the jazz music in the 20s in America. That was an influence into what we know today as jazz. We also had Black Protestant churches that became really popular and became really big and influenced the culture of the jazz funerals. So all of these cultures have layered on top of each other and given little parts of themselves to create what we know today. Now, what is a jazz funeral? What do they do at a jazz funeral? So at a jazz funeral today, in our version, you have a deceased person and their funeral, and that's at a funeral home. And then after that, you will have a parade, and it's called the first line. So the first line in the parade is going to be your parade master, the deceased, the family and friends, the mourners, if you will, who are invited to the funeral, and then the band walking behind them. Now, the first line will walk through the city, through the streets, through the neighborhoods, and they will play somber music and somber hymns, and they're all very traditional hymns and traditional music that will be played. Now, this parade will go until the final resting spot is reached. At the final resting spot, they do what is called cutting loose. So that means they cut loose the body for it to go cross over into the afterlife, and then they also cut loose themselves. So they will bury the body of the deceased, and then they will turn it into more of a upbeat party type aspect. Now, this first line is the people who are there and know and love the deceased. After, when they start playing the music, it's going to be traditional hymns and upbeat music, and everybody's in a party, everybody's laughing, everyone's having fun. It's more of a celebrational time for the loved one. Now, of course, with that first line, you also have a second line, and that second line is where the community aspect that I adore comes into play. So the community aspect is going to be your second line, which is people who don't even know the deceased will be able to see the parade passing by, and they will get in on it. They'll join, they'll walk to the funeral or walk to the cemetery with them, and they will mourn with them, and then they will celebrate with them. And it's people who were just at home and saw it passing by. It's very community oriented, and those people will have special umbrellas and special dancing shoes and special outfits, and they will get dressed and they will walk with the parade, and that's called the second line. Now, I say to you, we know about the cultural influences and we know what the funeral is, and I'd like to wrap up with one last thing to just get this through to you today. The jazz funeral, is very community oriented. It's very interesting. It's something that is so deeply rooted into New Orleans and the history that you have thousands and thousands of stories that all are slightly different, but all are the same. You have people who have done this their whole lives who are now well into their elderly stages of life. You have kids that know what this is. This is something the community does together. And that's why it has stood the test of time from hundreds of years ago as a basic type of funeral to now the more eccentric that we know and love today. And I think that is very important to understand that this is something that has held the test of time and will continue to hold the test of time. And I hope that you have been informed enough to do some more research on your own and learn more about jazz funerals today. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.